Modi, Vikram-1 launch defining moment for India, breaking thenews.net. That single number resets the India playbook. The key question is not what happened, but what changes next for operators and users. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Launch Vikram-1, the private sector's first orbital rocket, or delay for another quarter. Prime Minister Modi just announced it's happening. And this single launch is reshaping how India competes in a $424 billion global space economy. Here's what most people are missing: Vikram-1 isn't about putting a satellite in orbit. It's about proving India can do what only 5 nations have done before: build a privately owned, reusable rocket infrastructure. SpaceX did it. China did it. Russia did it. India's been watching from the sidelines. Until now. So why does Modi's backing matter? Because in India, government validation unlocks 3 things simultaneously: regulatory fast-tracking, institutional credibility, and access to the defense establishment's supply chains. When Modi endorses a space project at the national level, procurement officers at Bangalore's satellite manufacturers start returning phone calls. Universities start teaching the curriculum. Private equity starts writing checks. The Vikram-1 rocket is being built by Skyroot Aerospace, a Bangalore-based startup founded in 2018. Their team includes former ISRO scientists and IIT graduates. The rocket is designed to carry 300 kilograms to orbit. That doesn't sound like much until you realize that 60% of satellite launches are for Earth observation, communications, and IoT monitoring, all tasks that don't need SpaceX's Falcon 9 capacity. You can launch cheaper, more frequently, and on your schedule. But here's the contrarian angle: India's space launch industry was completely closed until 2021. ISRO held a monopoly. Private companies could build components, but only ISRO could launch. That changed when the government opened the sector. Skyroot, Relativity Space India, and Agnikul Cosmos all emerged. Within 3 years, 3 companies are on the brink of commercial launches. That's not incremental progress, that's regime change. What Modi's announcement really signals is this: India is betting that space entrepreneurship, not just government science, is the future. The economic implication is huge. If Vikram-1 succeeds, the operational cost per kilogram to orbit drops by 60%. That unlocks satellite constellations for Indian telecom, agriculture monitoring for farmers, and disaster response imaging for the government. Every industry that relies on satellite data suddenly has cheaper, faster access. For Indian startups and engineers, this is a talent magnet. The satellite and launch industry will absorb thousands of engineers in the next 5 years. IIT graduates who might have left for Silicon Valley now have a pathway to build critical infrastructure at home. That's a compounding advantage over the next decade. Globally, this matters because India enters a duopoly that was previously a monopoly. SpaceX's Falcon 9 has dominated commercial launches for 8 years. Now India offers a credible alternative for smaller payloads, lower cost, and government backing. That competition forces SpaceX to innovate faster and price more aggressively. It also fragments launch capacity geopolitically. No single nation controls access to orbit anymore. The regulatory angle is equally important. India's Department of Space is now actively nurturing a commercial ecosystem. Land for launch facilities, tax incentives, and streamlined licensing are all on the table. Compare that to the EU, which still hasn't launched its first private orbital rocket. India is moving faster. But Vikram-1 also faces real risks. The rocket hasn't launched yet. Payload integration issues, weather delays, or a booster failure would set India's commercial space narrative back 18 months. The window between success and failure is razor-thin. One launch is not a program. One success is not a track record. What changes next is critical. If Vikram-1 launches successfully in the next 8 weeks, expect announcements from at least 2 other Indian startups claiming they're next. ISRO will likely announce a timeline for its own private launch capability. International telecom and Earth observation companies will start publicly considering Indian providers for future constellation launches. That's worth $50 billion in addressable market opportunity over the next decade. For viewers in India, this is worth paying attention to because space infrastructure becomes foundational to every economic layer above it. Precision agriculture depends on satellite positioning. Disaster response depends on rapid imaging. Rural internet connectivity depends on mega-constellations like Starlink, but Indian alternatives will eventually be cheaper and locally controlled. This launch isn't just a headline, it's the first domino in a decade-long shift. Follow the next 60 days closely. Every successful test flight builds momentum. Every delay creates doubt. Modi's backing buys political patience, but not forever. Vikram-1 is a defining moment because it proves India can compete in a frontier industry. Everything after this launch depends on execution. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.